But still, many people have the perception that this war is unwinnable for Ukraine, when in fact, it's unwinnable for Russia. Russia is presently getting its ass kicked by Ukraine, right? They control less than they controlled after the first, blushes of the large-scale invasion. Russia couldn't survive a war with NATO. They couldn't do it. If NATO entered Ukraine, got to the zero line and started pushing, Russia would be driven out of the country in a matter of weeks. But here we're seeing an interesting case. In my estimation, we've got a mafia boss, and he's not keeping the lid on his subordinates, right? The boss doesn't want the underbosses fighting it out. They should all do what the boss says. But what's interesting to me in this case is they're not paying attention to Putin, which might be a bigger problem than we know.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Today we have Chuck Potter, a former squadron leader of SEAL Team 6. Welcome.
Thanks, man. Thanks for having me.
Perfect. So we can jump just straight in. The first question is about the North Korean troops, the news we've been getting just a few hours before we hopped on. U.S. Defense Department that confirmed that they have information too. So first, I wanted to ask you, what does this say about the Russian military? Like, they're asking North Korea for help, and not just weapons. And now they're asking for troops.
Russian troops have made gains throughout this summer, but that was predictable about last Christmas when the U.S. Congress got in the way of the arms shipment. I wrote at the time for the Kyiv Post that this summer was going to be the time of consequence, because that lack of arms, that bubble, as it were, that void space moved through the supply chain, and it was going to result in tactical gains for the Russians this summer as Ukraine ran out of artillery shells, ran out of anti-tank missiles, ran out of air defense assets. So that was predictable. But Russian casualties this summer have been greater than any time during the war. They've gained terrain, but there's been very few days where they've lost less than 1,000 troops a day. And in the past couple of weeks, they're losing 1,500, 1,700 troops a day. It was understandable that North Korea was going to provide 3 million artillery shells a year. That's about half of what Russia uses in Ukraine every year. It wasn't so surprising that with North Korean ballistic missiles and artillery systems as well, that North Korean advisors, and in the case of missiles, North Korean crews to fire those missiles. That was understandable that they would show up. There are somewhere between 3,000 and 10,000 North Korean troops in occupied Ukraine or in Russian territory adjacent to Ukraine. What has been surprising is there are somewhere between 50 and 100,000 North Korean troops training in eastern Russia. That has been a surprise for everyone. First information on that was reported about a week ago, but Secretary Austin has confirmed it now.
Do you think they'll have a big impact on the front line, or we're still not sure if they will go to the front line?
Well, we don't know that yet. I will point this out. North Korea has a very large army. They have not had any direct ground maneuver combat in over 70 years. So although their troops may be highly motivated, they don't have any real world experience. So this would make sense that they're being trained by the Russians before they would deploy into Ukraine. No one really knows right now, are they going to be entering combat? Are they going to be support troops? That is the $64,000 question. It's important to note that if North Korean troops enter ground combat, it's going to change a lot of things, the manner in which Russia relates to the rest of the world. This is going to be seen as internationalizing the conflict. Russia is going to be suffering economic and sanction consequences if this is going to happen, if North Korea enters the war. The problem is, Putin does not seem to foresee consequences very well. When he invaded in the first time, many people, including me, thought he wouldn't invade because it would revitalize NATO, that Finland and Sweden would join NATO. All of these direct consequences he didn't seem to care about. So what's worrying is maybe he doesn't care about getting North Korea into this fight. it's something to worry about.
For sure, that makes sense. But as you said earlier, we do know there are troops helping with the missiles that North Korea is sending. Is that something the West needs to respond to, or is that something that's not as big of a deal?
Well, there are more than a score of North Korean ballistic missiles have been fired at Ukrainian cities. It was not Russian soldiers who fired those missiles. Those missile launchers did not come over with their instruction manuals translated into Russian. It was North Korean troops who fired them. Per se, there are North Korean troops in combat in Ukraine because of that. A number of North Korean officers have been killed in a targeted strike by Ukraine. This was in an area contiguous to the zero line. We know that 19 North Korean troops have already defected. They have left their places. We also know, this isn't very often reported, that Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps members are also in Ukraine. They deal with the Shahed drones, and they facilitate training. And in the early stages of the Shahed's debut, it was Iranians who were launching them. These are things definitely to keep a mind on. The very short answer to that question, are North Korean forces in occupied Ukraine, are they combatants? In my estimation, they already are. If you're shooting a missile at a Ukrainian city, you're in the fight.
100%, that makes sense. Talking about troops, Russia, as you said, insanely, the most deadliest week they've had since the war started. And they are recruiting roughly 30,000 new troops per month to fill the gap, I'm guessing. Are they well-trained troops, the new troops that are coming in? Is that going to affect, as we go into the fight, into the winter, all these new troops that are coming in?
Well, that's one of the problems, that Russia is already in what Colonel John Spencer and I last year called the training death loop. We hear from Russian soldiers themselves that they often receive less than 2 weeks training before they find themselves on the zero line. And it essentially takes them 2 weeks to get there. So they're not really training, they're sitting on trains and buses and transit camps. So they arrive at the zero line without the fundamental training that a soldier needs, right? In the United States, it takes almost a year for an infantryman to receive his training. Basic training, infantry school, and some advanced schools. It takes basically 18 months to make a ranger. He'll go through all of those training, then ranger school, then jump school. It takes 2 years to train a Green Beret, 2 years to train a Navy SEAL. So you've got these people arriving on the battlefield. Notice I didn't say soldiers. These people, they don't know how to do the fundamental skills of a soldier: shoot, move, and communicate, right? You have to know how to use all the weapon systems you're supposed to be using, not just a rifle, mortars, RPGs, except dozens of weapons. They don't know how to use them. They don't know anything about land navigation. You give them a compass and a map, and they look at it like a hog looking at a wristwatch. So those are some of the reasons that these soldiers arrive. Russia can only carry out daylight assaults. They can only do operations in broad daylight. And we've all seen what a first-person drone will do to a soldier in broad daylight. So they're recruiting 30,000 people a month. They lose 30,000 people a month, and the quality of the individual soldier keeps going down.
By the way, before we move forward, I know you have a new podcast that I've been listening to, and I'm learning a lot. So I wanted to tell our audience that I'll link it up here on the right side, up there, or in the description. Definitely check it out. And it's really great. Next question. I'm sure you've seen the civil war that's been popping up between the Chechnya leader and the Dagestani leader. How's that affecting the internal politics of Russia and Putin's position?
It's good to think of national command authority in Russia, not so much in terms of a government or even necessarily a dictatorship, but think of it as a mafia crime family. Vladimir Putin, in my estimation, is the richest person in the world. He commands all of the natural assets, the financial systems. He commands everything in Russia. If you are a trusted oligarch, he can toss you not just a company, but an industry. Not just one natural resource, but all of that natural resource. What he expects in return is he gave you everything, you give him everything he wants. So in the case of the Chechnya and Dagestan back and forth, we have competing oligarchs who are now fighting over one of those prizes. It's a significant split because the Chechen leader has already announced a blood feud, which is an endemic part of their culture. It's basically, you've drawn blood against me. There was some shooting at the Raspberry industry headquarters. There's going to have to be blood to pay for that. But here we're seeing an interesting case. In my estimation, we've got a mafia boss and he's not keeping the lid on his subordinates, right? The boss doesn't want the underbosses fighting it out. They should all do what the boss says. But what's interesting to me in this case is they're not paying attention to Putin, which might be a bigger problem than we know.
So I guess since it is, let's say it is like a mafia state, so it's not necessarily the citizens or the regular citizens who can threaten Putin's power. It's probably the people who are supporting him. I wonder if that's having any effect on how much control or is there's a divide in Russia because of how the war is going among like the oligarchs and the warlords who support him?
It's interesting, the oligarchs receive everything from Putin and ostensibly will give everything to Putin as he asks for it. Dictatorships like this throughout history, we have seen, they seem incredibly stable. And in fact, they are stable until they're not. And then things change very, very quickly. Nicolae Ceausescu, the dictator of Romania, was giving a happy speech. And within 20 minutes, the 100,000 people gathered in the square rushed the building he was in. 24 hours later, he'd been killed by a revolutionary court. Muammar Gaddafi got up to take a tour of his city in his limousine, and 3 hours later, he was being pulled out of a road culvert and was torn to pieces by the crowd. So does the crown rest easy on Putin's head? Putin remembers that Prigozhin mutinied, drove to Rostov-on-Don, took over the military headquarters, then turned on Moscow. And Putin never forgets that no one stopped him. Nobody. Not one soldier said, stop, don't go any farther. Not one soldier said, where are you going with all those tanks? The only part of the Russian armed services that even made any attempt to resist was the Russian Air Force, and they lost half a dozen aircraft. Putin's got problems. And like I said, everything goes well in that dictatorial system until it doesn't. And we only need look Nero, Caligula, the Roman emperors, as vicious as they were, everything was good for them until it wasn't. And the Praetorian Guard is what turned on him, i.e. the oligarchs. So we'll see. He bears watching at all times.
Also, Ukraine's probably taking advantage of this. They've been attacking a lot inside Russia. So far, like let's say a week ago, they were attacking military facilities, oil stuff. I think now they have started going a little bit more towards what Russian citizens cares a little bit more. They've been attacking these alcohol factories. And Russia is a big alcohol drinker. I wonder if that's changing the mood in the Russian citizens' mind of how the war is going.
It has to be entering their mind. And it's also important to know, when Russia talks about it's a red line if you give Ukraine attackums, and it's a red line if anyone attacks Russia. Here's the interesting thing. NATO has given no weapons to Ukraine that can attack 600 or 1,000 miles into Russia. Ukraine made those weapons by hand, often in garages, right? These things were prototyped by a bunch of mega geeks, and they work. And they have hit strategic Air Force bases. They have hit major armories. They have hit stockpiles of North Korean ballistic missiles. They are sending a message. Oil, petroleum oil and lubricants, refineries. They've impacted oil refinery to such an extent that Russia can no longer export diesel fuel, right? Which is one of the most important things you need for your army. So this stuff is very effective. It cannot be unnoticed by the people. And you're right. Now they're branching out to, let's just call them consumer goods. And the Russian people will definitely notice that.
I know this is something you cover a lot, the information warfare that's been going on this war. So maybe you could talk a little bit about how both sides are doing it and how are they managing and countering each other's like propaganda.
I'm eyeballs deep into the information war on the Ukrainian side, but I do have to say this as an assessment. The West is basically playing defense in the information war. The Russians may not be so good in training ground soldiers and not so good considering, their superiority in numbers and equipment in ground warfare, but in terms of information warfare, no one is as good as they are. They know how to inject extreme positions into the dialogue. They know how to press buttons, whether it's racism, classism, nationalism. They are able to lower the tone of the discourse and get people turning against each other. They're masterful at it. So, for example, I've been covering the war and getting out there as much as possible. All I try to do most of the time is set the record straight. People are a great assessment this summer. Well, Ukraine's been losing territory all summer. Ukraine has lost less territory this summer than the Russians lost in Kursk. So Russia lost 1,000 square kilometers of its own territory and gained less than 1,000 square kilometers in Ukraine. But still, the impression for most people who don't follow it closely is Ukraine's losing the war. Well, they're not. It's Russia that's losing 1,000 people a day. This is a staggering sum. Russia will lose 360,000 men this year alone.
Yeah.
They've already lost 400,000. So by this time, I don't know, in 5 months from now, they will have lost 700,000 men. But still, many people have the perception that this war is unwinnable for Ukraine, when in fact, it's unwinnable for Russia.
Since they do have a disadvantage in terms of like weaponaries and on the battlefield, they have to invest so heavily and they have to get good at information warfare.
They're exceptionally good at it. Let's say you've got a dial and it goes from, absolute crap and propaganda to truth, right? It's so much easier to get that needle to go over to crap and bullshit. It's so much easier. You make a false accusation about somebody. You have an aid organization and you say, well, these guys they had a conference in Paris. They're wasting the money that you've donated. Well, that's not true. But now that organization has to say, hey, look, nobody went to Paris. That didn't happen. For example, the Russians came out about last year and it was Mrs. President Zelensky's wife had bought a Bentley in Paris and they had the receipt. Well, that never happened. But it took weeks to undo that perception. And by then they'd moved on to something else. So in information warfare, it's much easier to be on offense. It's much harder to be on defense. And face it, NATO and the West, they're not very good at conducting nefarious information operations. They're just not. The other thing is they don't really have to be. You can bring these facts forward. They're disturbing enough. Normally it would be called black propaganda if I said the Russians shot at a children's hospital. That's just outrageous lie to make the Russians look bad, when in fact the Russians have destroyed 1,500 hospitals in Ukraine so far. All you need to do is express the truth that they're targeting civilians and civilian infrastructure. But it's a very complex struggle. And you know what? We're not winning it.
Well, that does bring up an interesting point though, right? Why couldn't we try to just spread the truth? I guess we don't even have to make up lies, as you just said, in the Russian public. Like, wouldn't that help at least? Like, if there's more pressure on Putin. So, like, if we go on offensive, maybe we'll have to be less focused on being so defensive. Because even when we try to fight back, we try to spread the truth among the Western audiences, right? Which is definitely like important, but why not like give them the taste of their own medicine?
Well, it would be great, but in terms of penetrating the information space within Russia, it's very difficult, right? Because all the media, it used to be most of the media was state controlled. Now it's almost all of it. And the Russian propaganda channels, which I monitor a little bit, bloodthirsty, saying things literally like we're going to nuke Paris, we're going to nuke London. I mean, it's garbage, but that is what the Russian people consume every day. So I do agree with you that truth is the best weapon, and that's why I'm out there. I don't know. I put out a couple of thousand battle maps over the last, 900 days. Uh, I speak a lot to the media. I'm on a lot of media networks, and I just try to just put out what the truth is. If the news is bad, I say it. If the news is good, I say it. If it is an ambiguous situation, well, I'm going to point out these were the Russian losses, these were the Ukrainian losses, and here's where the battle line is now. In my estimation, as far as this war goes, Russia set out to conquer Ukraine. They're not doing it. As far as this war goes for Russia, this is 1970, and it's the Americans in Vietnam. They haven't lost the war yet, but there is no way that they're going to win it. At Russia's state of advance right now, it's going to take them 400 years to get to the Polish border. And another thing is, look, Russia doesn't have a plan to win this war. There is no Operation Overlord. They don't have Monty and Eisenhower in the back room with the big battle plan that'll win this war by next summer. They don't have it. They don't have the leadership. They don't have the material. They don't have the soldiers. They don't have anything it's going to take to win this war. Great armored formations. 30% of the world's Javelin missiles are in eastern Ukraine. The first-person drones have made tanks, if not obsolete, then no longer very effective. So the war's changed. Tactics have changed.
It seems not just Russia, a lot of the world is waiting for the election results. That's, I think, in 2 weeks now. I wanted to get your thoughts on how you think the war would play out, depending on who wins. So again, we don't know who would win, still 2 weeks out, but let's say if it's Trump or if it's Harris, how would Russia react? How would Ukraine react?
Yeah, I treat American politics like the third rail, So, but I will say this. It is vital for Ukraine to keep receiving help from the United States and NATO. It's going to be very difficult for Ukraine to win this war using only its own resources. There has been a problem with the present regime. The national security apparatus of the United States, in my estimation, has misapprehended the threat that Russia poses. Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor, he seems to worship Russia's red lines and sees no red lines being crossed by Russia. In my estimation, if you hit a children's hospital in downtown Kiev on the fourth floor with a cruise missile, you've crossed a red line, right? If you take the city of Mariupol and approximately 50,000 unmarked graves surround that city, you've crossed a red line. In my estimation, Putin's nuclear threats are a bluff. It is literally like someone saying, I'm going to shoot you, and they put the pistol up to their own temple and point their other ear at you. It isn't going to happen. It categorically is not going to happen. And to add a little bit of more ludicrousness to this, he's conducted 5 tests of his latest Satan IBM. 3 of them broke up in flight, and the other one had to be destroyed when it turned for Toledo. It's not even a relevant threat. It's Russia that poses the biggest threat to the security of Europe. in this part of the 21st century. It's in the interest of the United States to see that Ukraine remains a free nation, and let's put it this way, a bulwark against Russian aggression, because this will not be the last war Russia starts waged against his former satellites. It's invaded Chechnya twice. It's invaded Georgia. It invaded Moldova. It look what it's done to Ossetia. Putin is the last Homo Sovieticus. He's the last Soviet man, and he is trying to put together the Soviet Union again. That's the threat.
Since you bring up Moldova, what do you think about the election results that just came out 2 days ago?
I don't know what to think. It's, and again, we talk about an information war, and let's change the name of information war and let's call it a political campaign, because they're kind of the same thing. To me, I truly stand in awe of what Russia can do in the information space. And they inherited that ability from the Soviet Union, who before them, they were kings of the information space as well. And it isn't just, it can have profound physical effects, not just tainting information, but it can help swing policy. So it's truly a tool that Putin, who was a KGB officer, he knows how important it is. And especially when you can inflect the politics of these susceptible, weaker states that are still in your gravitational orbit. And he's really good at it.
Yeah. I mean, Georgian elections, I think, are coming up in a few days too. So let's see how that plays out. Do you think there's a chance that there's a Russian war with NATO?
That's another thing that is floated out there. In terms of GDP, Russia has the GDP of Italy. Okay. Russia is presently getting its ass kicked by Ukraine, right? They control less than they controlled after the first, blushes of the large-scale invasion. Russia couldn't survive a war with NATO. They couldn't do it. If NATO entered Ukraine, got to the zero line and started pushing, Russia would be driven out of the country in a matter of weeks and maybe even days. But like the nuclear threat, Russia blustering that, it's not afraid of a war with NATO, yes, it is. Yes, it is. Yeah, I'll give you a little example. There's a town, not even a town, a little village on the south bank of the Dnipro near Kherson. Ukraine had about 400 troops in that village. It was called Krinky. An entire division, 20,000 Russian paratroopers were fought to a standstill by 400 Ukrainians. How would you feel if it was the American 101st Airborne Division and you told them to take a village in a river town? How long do you think that would take? 12 hours? 6? 4? These guys got their butts kicked over a 7-month battle, and that the Russian airborne unit had to be withdrawn. That's not winning. That's a systemic, endemic problem with the Russian military. And their airborne forces, which are a separate service to the Russians, like the Marine Corps, it's a separate service. They're their most elite troops. It didn't work out so good. And I see this happening again and again and again. I mean, I map battles almost daily. I see Russian forces with high numbers of troops on the point of attack. For example, recently, 2 weeks ago, a Russian battalion attacked south of Kupiansk towards the Oskil River. That was interesting because they normally don't attack in battalion-size forces. They attack in platoon and company, very much smaller units. So they sent 900 guys, 20 tanks, 40 infantry fighting vehicles, and they pushed towards these two villages. In 20 minutes, that force was totally destroyed. They lost 900 guys and 35 vehicles in 20 minutes. Attack took place in broad daylight. They concentrated in broad daylight. They left the point of attack in broad daylight. They divided their forces before they got to the objective. All of these are idiotic, childish mistakes that they make over and over again. But a battalion defeated in 90 minutes, look, you've got problems from the top all the way to the bottom. And that is not the only case. That is one of 20 or 30 points of contact just like that I could name off the top of my head. They've got big problems with their military. They're not going to win.
What is the goal? What are they hoping for? Do you think there's a way Ukraine could get into NATO? Is that like the end of the war? How would this end?
In my estimation, the thing that needs to happen is want to return Ukraine to the status quo antebellum. So we want to go back before the 2014 invasion, because this war's been going on longer than 900 days. Ukraine deserves to have its country look the way it did before the war, but one of the objectives of this war has to be the defeat of the Russian army, right? Because as long as Putin has a club, a stick, a knife, whatever it is, an cogent together armed force to threaten his neighbors, he will continue to do that. So to me, the goal isn't just to push the Russians out of Ukraine, it's to break their army. And it's basically breaking itself. I go back to that encounter at Kupiansk. If you've got a battalion commander who's so inept that he makes every one of those fatal mistakes before his troops even get into contact, you've got a serious problem. And one of the problems is, Putin has raised up in 20 years an entire officer class that are utterly corrupt. They're grifters. They're not scholars. They're not warriors. They're not people who take pride in the profession of arms. They're grifters. And it shows. They're inept. They can't carry out these operations. And it's one other point I like to underline. If anyone thinks Russia is going to win this war, just tell me how they're going to win it. Show me the big arrows going over from all over and how they're going to get to Kyiv. Just show me how they're going to do it. There is no plan. That's why I hearken back to the Vietnam War. There was no plan for America to win the Vietnam War. And what do you know? They didn't. So there's one thing that's keeping this war going. It's Putin. This was his idea. It was supposed to take 72 hours. It was supposed to be bloodless. He's lost 600,000 people so far in this war. And this year, he's going to lose 300,000 more. Man, that ain't winning.
That's going to leave a big dent in the demographic for decades to come.
You're right. These guys in that traditional society, these are breadwinners. These are business owners, doctors, lawyers, plumbers, electricians, and they're gone. Putin knows it too. He gave a speech recently where he encouraged Russian women to have 8 children. Why? So he can shuffle them into Ukraine? Things are going bad over there.
I guess the economy is struggling too. And that brings us, I don't know if you've been following the BRICS summit that's been going on. What's Putin hoping to achieve there? What's the message he's trying to send to the West?
Well, he would like an alternative world currency. He wants to replace the petrodollar. It's interesting. He holds this summit, and the R in BRICS stands for rubles. But would you trade? You had $100,000 right now. Would you buy $100,000 worth of rubles? No, nobody would. So if he's trying to create this alternative world currency, that isn't looking so good. It's the meeting itself that is all the sizzle, right? And I don't think any of the countries there, in his presence, look, they're all talking behind the scenes just like you and I are talking. Russia's engaged in a war that is taking up much of its economy. As a consequence of that war, Russia is having to sell discounted oil products to the world, and that's all those other countries want. Discount Russian oil. And believe me, for example, China. China has plans for Asia, and they don't include Russia. They don't. No one should think that that they're together. They haven't been together since the Soviet-Sino split. And people might remember Russia and China went to war over that split, right? So I don't know. I'm not sure much will come of it, but what he does succeed in, he's got a little bit of the world 24-hour news bandwidth right now. That's pretty much all again, I think.
It does suck that UN Secretary General is going to visit Putin while the UN court, ICJ, has convicted him of international crime.
It's astounding. It really is. He is this mafia don. Don't look. Nobody should underestimate this guy. However, I do predict this: his rule and his government and his operation will seem completely stable until it isn't. And we have the examples from history, just how quickly those things can come apart. And don't forget Putin's Prigozhin's mutiny. Don't forget how far he got. Putin had to make promises to him, so he pulled back. And then, before Prigozhin's death, Putin and Prigozhin had 40 in-face meetings, right? He literally lulled this guy back in. And look, Prigozhin, the guy had an 8th grade education. Was he ready to deal with someone like Putin, who has a law degree and was a KGB officer? No. He just got lured in his innocent patriotism, and then he gets his jet blown up. That's what Putin has to devote so much of his own time to, is staying in power, like every dictator.
Now, before we end off, I do want to just get your thoughts on the Middle East a little bit. There have been a lot of Russian weapons that are being found in Hezbollah tunnels, and of course, the world is waiting for the Israeli response. First, let's just talk about, I guess, the response. It's taking a while. I didn't expect it to take this long. I wonder if this has to do with, like, it's actually possible to give a proper response, without planning. I'm sure that's playing a part. Or how much is it like politics of it, where it's like the election is coming up, U.S. probably putting pressure on them?
That is a good question. First, sort of the facts. It isn't surprising to someone like me that almost in every place I operated around the world, the adversarial forces, whether they are, armies of liberation, whether they were terrorist groups like Baader Meinhof or the Red Brigades, they always had Warsaw Pact weapons. It's been something that the Soviets did, and the Russians too. They are happy to create chaos wherever it is. They are happy to lean on the schisms. Whatever radical group, whether they are right radicals, neo-Nazis, or neo-Marxist revolutionary groups, they'll both be supplied by Russia, because the goal is to just create chaos. Israel's reaction to this, I don't know. I was speaking the other day about this, and the United States is going to be essentially adrift until the spring. We're coming up to the election cycle is going to culminate. Then we'll have a lame duck presidency until the inauguration, and then it's going to take a couple months for whomever is elected to put together their cabinet and the national security apparatus. That's one of the reasons Russia is working so hard now to gain whatever it can in Ukraine. So we're in this time of, a time of the United States taking its eye off the ball, unfortunately.
And did you have any thoughts about the Israeli response to the Iranian October 1st attack?
They have turned themselves, they're two interesting things. Hamas was able to carry out an attack that was absolutely unprecedented. This was Israel's Pearl Harbor. Heretofore, Israel thought it had a pretty good idea of whatever Hamas was going to do. It thought it knew. Something happened with that attack, and that was, and I believe this firmly, Russia and Iran were able to come in to dock with Hamas and say, we're going to teach you an entirely new way of conducting operational security. We're going to help you put together this compartmentalized operation that will be undiscoverable by the Israelis. We're going to show you how to do it. Now, we know that because Hamas leaders made trips to Moscow and Tehran, etc. So the Israelis were caught totally off guard because their intelligence coming out of Hamas was nothing. Okay, look what Israel was able to do to Hezbollah. They knew everything that Hezbollah was going to do. They sold them the beepers that killed and wounded 1,000. Then they sold them the walkie-talkies that killed and wounded the next level down. And then we saw by the surgical strikes it carried out in South Beirut that they knew at literally every building that was a front for Hamas. They knew where all the underground structures were, etc. What's the difference between those two intelligence pictures? Hamas with perfect airtight security and Hezbollah utterly penetrated. What happened? I'm thinking it was, Russian training and Russia helping to set up the October attacks. But again, there's a great book to be written on that. And we'll have to see.
Really appreciate all the answers today. And like always, for the audience, I'll link your podcast up and here in the card and in the description. And we hope to have you again soon.
Hey, many thanks. Thanks so much for having me. It was great talking to you.